Hello. Today I'd like to talk about a problem I've had both as a language teacher and as a language student in my first language and in other languages I've studied, and that is in a group of language students who are trying to learn how to give presentations or speeches in language, in the target language. The instructor and the students always get to the point where one student is giving a presentation and other students are waiting for that student to finish the presentation so they in turn can give their own presentations. And the problem for me, both as a student and as a teacher, is how can I assure that the students who are in the listening position are actually listening to what other students are trying to communicate. I recall that when I was a language student, for example, as a university student, I had a English speech class in which I had to make speeches to other students. While I was waiting for my turn to come up, I basically was not paying much attention to the other students' speeches because I was waiting nervously and planning my own speech. After I had finished my own speech and returned to my seat and listened to the other students' speeches, I didn't pay so much attention either because, I guess, because of the overwhelming feeling of relief. So I thought for a very long time about that problem. How can I assure that students will listen to other students? And I thought, well, what incentive can I give to students? What incentives can be set up for students to listen to other students? I realized that a common approach to making such an incentive is to have students write comments or evaluations of the presentation styles of other students and require that listening students turn those in. However, to me, that often seemed like a kind of make-work approach and didn't actually require listening as such. It required filling out forms. So the solution that I came up with the help of former colleague Stephen Williams, who unfortunately has died, the solution that I came up with was have students who are giving presentations give tests to students who are listening to the presentations, give tests on the content of their own presentation. So a student, for example, who gives a presentation about, say, the history of the automobile would give a test to students who listen about the history of the automobile. And this is an approach to presentation and speech classes that I have used now for going on 10 years or so. And I'll get to explaining how I arrange the classes in just a moment. However, keep in mind that my approach is, of course, influenced by the constraints under which I work, the situation in which I work, and that is that my background is in secondary and tertiary foreign language education. So most of the students I'm dealing with have the same first language. That said, I'd also like to explain some of the general principles under which I operate my presentation classes. First is I try to arrange classes so that each student and all students can contribute uniquely to the class, regardless of their general target language proficiency. I believe that any language learner as a person knows at least one topic or one theme that other people in a relatively small group do not. hobbies, for example, perhaps some experiences, are things that are not shared by every member of a class, regardless of how close their educational backgrounds and social backgrounds might be. I also believe strongly that language learning is enhanced by using the target language for the actual transfer of information rather than practice only. Also, I think that language learning tasks are more likely to be taken seriously when accomplishing those tasks has a fairly clear and immediate reward. In this case, getting a high score on a test. I also believe, and this becomes pertinent and will become pertinent in a little bit, that language learners are, especially in my situation, teaching outside of the United States, more likely to interact with more likely to interact with other L2 language users than with native speakers of whatever target language is being studied. I also believe that lectures by the instructor are an effective way to transfer information, but not the only effective way. So with those beliefs in my practice, I developed the following system. A very simple, short summary is that I ask every student in a class to think of a topic that he or she would like to give a presentation about, or as I often put it in class, teach other students about for 10 minutes in the target language. And that topic, that whatever they happen to choose, is the topic of their presentation or their speech, and the topic about which they test other students. I have used this approach in classes ranging from sizes of 16 to 48, I believe, is the largest number of classes. And generally, the language proficiency level of classes in which I use this is pretty much the same. There's not a great deal of variation in the classes that I teach. Also, this perhaps is not particularly pertinent. The classes that I teach are usually 90 minutes long. And a very important point is that my classes, as I mentioned, are usually fairly large, which means that as an instructor, I usually cannot listen to all of the presentations that students give while they are giving them. I always record presentations, depending on class size, either with video cameras or with integrated circuit recorders, some kind of recorder. I used to use cassettes, and I listen to the students' presentations from the recordings. So keep in mind that when I have 10 minutes, 10-minute presentations from 48 students, I'm looking at 480 minutes of my own listening after the classes, after the presentations have been done. So if you don't have a lot of time to devote to reviewing presentations outside of class time, I don't recommend this approach. So the general goal of the lessons is that each student be able to give a 10-minute presentation on a specific topic that can be understood by any other student in the particular class. And of course, as a complement, because each student is being tested on what he or she hears, each student will be able to understand the gist and most of the important details of several expository presentations. Now, going back to the class size problem, and the reason that I have to listen to presentations after they've actually been made is that I always have presentations done in small groups of students, so that in a group of 48, for example, I will set up 12 groups of 4 students each, so that each student is giving a 10-minute presentation to which 3 other students listen. And then one of the 3 listening students next will give his or her presentation to the other students, and so on, until all 4 students have finished. As I mentioned, I ask students to give a 10-minute presentation. My classes are usually 90 minutes long. The reason that I have 40 minutes of presentation in a 90-minute class is that logistics, setting up the presentations and stopping the presentations, and question and answer time take a long time. So that is the way I set up the tests. And I have taught this these kind of classes in class sessions usually that last 1 semester, or 14 or 15 90-minute sessions. And the presentations I usually ask students to give in the second to last, the penultimate class. And in the ultimate class, the final class, students will test other students on their presentations. And I believe this is useful in allowing note-taking, in fostering note-taking and question-asking skills, and also in ameliorating some of the differences in memorization abilities that students might have. I believe memorization abilities are extra-linguistic. So by having students take a test a week after they've heard a presentation, I necessitate that they listen and take notes. Of course, the tests are always open note tests. So the students, I hope, are able to simulate what they would be doing in a business meeting, say an academic conference, trying to gain information and keep the information in their minds, or keep the information in the extension of their minds, their notebooks or computers or what have you. So that is the way that I run my classes. I believe that this setup is something that allows students to concentrate on the actual transfer of information, both giving and getting, to, in giving presentations, adjust their language so that people actually listening to them can understand their language, to be able to learn to check if people listening do understand what the presenter is saying. It also fosters paraphrasing, I believe, if there are signs that the original phrasing of an idea is not understood. A student has practice in rephrasing the information so that everyone listening can understand it. And then in relative detail, this is how my courses are set up. The first goal, the first thing that I have students learn, the first thing that I ask students to practice, the first thing that I try to teach is various phrases in English that are used to control speakers. And what I mean by that is how to ask for clarification, how to ask for repetition, how to check that one's understanding is what actually is being presented. And this I do with various exercises. And depending on the level of the class, I usually teach 2 or 3, at least, phrases for asking for clarification, such as I'm not sure I understand what you mean. Asking for repetition, what was that again, for example. Checking understanding, in other words, do you mean, and then adding a paraphrase. And this I find with, I usually spend the first couple of classes practicing with various exercises, and strongly encourage by revealing lessons throughout my course, students to continue to practice using these phrases throughout their time in the course. I also, of course, tell students who are the recipients of these questions or requests for clarification, requests for how to respond to the questions, how to frame their recasts of their information and so forth. And I usually ask students to practice this with 3 or 4 different rounds of exercises, each round becoming less fixed in the language or information structure that they use. First, for example, I ask students simply to read and take notes on various numbers, addresses, and so forth. Next, a little bit more difficult, I ask students to explain about their own families, 3 generations of family, and listening students are required to draw a family tree that represents the speaker's family. And a third step is very often a detailed narrative of one day's activity. And you'll notice that in each exercise that I'm asking students to do, the information structure and the language that listeners can expect to hear, the guessing about the content that they can do before actually listening, becomes less and less, so that an address, for example, is usually both short and in a certain format in English, from smaller to larger in time. Families always have the same relationships generally, only names and ages and so forth differ. And then the most free of these exercises, the explaining of one day's activity, generally students can assume only waking up, going to sleep, and a couple of meals. Otherwise, everything else is, almost everything else is different, student by student. Besides that, I also, while this practice is going on, inform students of topics that are appropriate for the final presentation, topics that students in other classes have used successfully, and so forth. I sometimes, in longer classes or more advanced classes, go over information structuring, basically outlining for different kinds of topics, chronologic order, topical order, sometimes spatial order of information ordering, cause and effect order, and so forth. Although in the last several years, I have found that dropping that outlining section really does not change students' abilities very much. So I've tended to go away from doing that. The next phase of lessons is on paraphrasing, and this is especially important if the abilities of the students are a little bit mixed. And one should keep in mind, of course, that students are going to be talking about a specialty, something that they know that other students don't. And in talking about a specialty, speakers tend to forget that listeners don't know special vocabulary and are not familiar with the topic itself. So I spend a lot of time teaching techniques for example, explaining specialized nouns in non-specialized language, explaining what particular verbs mean using other verbs and so forth. The goal being, of course, to stop students from depending on translation, which is not something they can usually do in their future target language use. Meanwhile, I'm also giving lessons about testing because in my classes the final tests that students take on their co-students' presentations count toward their grades, which means that I, as an instructor, have to ensure that each student is giving a fair and unbiased test to other students. So we spend parts of some lessons going over different kinds of test forms, test styles, performance tests, multiple choice tests, true-false tests, fill in the blank or short completion tests, sentence completion tests rather, matching tests, ordering tests, and so forth, and various pitfalls in test development that people can run into. This, of course, is all done in English, and I'm using the kind of language that students will be using in their own presentations. We also, of course, I usually end up recommending for most students that they use multiple choice tests, and I usually devote part of one lesson to the pitfalls of multiple choice test question development. For example, poor distractors, distractors that are too easy to eliminate, ambiguous stems, a particular problem in English when the person of verbs can give a hint about answers in sentence completion, multiple choice tests, for example. Difficulties in scoring fill-in answers and ambiguous answers, or answers that are not completely separate. Meanwhile, I also schedule for the 2 sessions before the final presentation practice presentations. So basically the final 4 lessons of the class do not include any language instruction from me. The third to last lesson is a practice presentation with one other student, and that one other student, I seem to have lost, I think I'm back. The final 4 class sessions do not have any instruction from me. The final class is the tests, and the penultimate class are the presentations from students. And the third and fourth to last classes I devote to practice presentations. And in this case, I ask students to practice one-on-one their final presentations. In this case, I both allow and encourage first language use if the students have the same first language. And in the practice presentations, one student will give a practice presentation to one other student, and the student listening is responsible for taking notes as if he or she is going to take a test, and then also timing the presentation, and after the presentation is finished, writing in the in the first language a very detailed report about strong points of the presentation, weak points of the presentation, how the presentation could be enhanced, for example, by visuals or examples, and the student who originally was listening in turn next gives his or her own presentation. And this I ask students to do 2 times. One time in the fourth to last class, and another time a revised presentation in the next, the third to last class session with a different student. And then finally, each student will have practiced twice and gotten first language, usually first language feedback on the presentation, which allows the students to, I hope, improve and expand on their presentations before they have to give the final presentation. And then finally, on the day of the final presentations, I randomly assign students in my classes to groups. Almost randomly. The students who have listened to practice presentations are never in the practice presenters groups, so that each student is hearing final presentations for the first time only, even though each speaker has practiced 2 or 3 times already. And the presentations are given, and in the final class session, students test the other students on their presentations. Because I, the instructor, don't know the answers to the tests, the students who have given the tests check the answers and present the other students' scores to me, and I use the scores as part of the students' grades, which means that the percentage of the final class grade that the test scores make up varies depending on my classes. The lowest percentage is 20%, and I've gone up to 40% in some specialized advanced language classes. But that basically is my solution to the problem of why bother listening? Why bother listening to other students' presentations in a presentation class, in a language class? And that is my solution, because if you don't listen, you won't pass the tests on the topics that you're listening to, and you won't get a good grade, or perhaps won't even pass the class. As usual, I welcome comments and questions about this presentation or about my approach to presentation classes. On my blog, website blog, I do have a fairly old version of a write-up of a lot of the information in this presentation, which everyone is welcome to download. I thank you for listening, and I will close here. Goodbye.